All right, welcome to the Return to Freud. This is the 29th workshop in the Return to Freud. Today we are going to be covering a paper from 1917 titled A Difficulty in the Path of Psychoanalysis. This is thematically in line with where we are in this Return to Freud. We're approaching the end of Freud's emphasis on developing the libido theory. In that regard, I think that this paper can be situated as an attempt to communicate on a broad scale to the ego about what libido theory is and what the consequences are for the ego. I think that there's in particular a long section of this paper, which is really like a letter to the ego, almost trying to communicate to, I'm assuming, other professionals who are resistant to psychoanalysis, just how this theory and this way of thinking impacts the way we think about ourselves, not only psychologically, but broadly, metaphysically. So let's get into that. I'll share my screen. Okay. A difficulty in the path of psychoanalysis, again from 1917. Before starting the presentation, I just want to suggest that the best way to stay in touch with my work and also to support online labor is to go to my Patreon, and you can also find updates on basically everything I'm doing there. I also have a somewhat special announcement that the original Return to Freud or Freudian Unconscious course that I gave in 2019 is now available on Philosophy Portal Online with new, never before seen content, specifically reflections on Freud's original writings, as well as the option to work with me one-on-one if you're interested in going deeper into learning about the Freudian unconscious. And just also that my PhD thesis, Global Brain Singularity, is also available. All links to these things are in the description below. With that being said, let's start the presentation. So a difficulty in the path of psychoanalysis. He starts off very clearly that the difficulty in the path of psychoanalysis is not an intellectual difficulty. It's not something in which the actual information is, let's say, difficult to understand or comprehend, as someone may feel about going into, for example, a lecture on quantum physics or statistics or evolutionary theory. But rather, it's an affective difficulty. It's a problem of the heart, or it's a problem of the emotions. He says psychoanalysis alienates the feelings of those who come into contact with it and are less inclined to take interest in it. I think I can reflect on myself on when I came into contact with psychoanalysis. It was something I started to take seriously intellectually when I first had an inclination towards the problems it was pointing towards. So if someone is not inclined to take what psychoanalysis is pointing towards seriously, then one has a tendency to shut down or turn away from it. What psychoanalysis focuses on, he says, is libido theory. Like as I prefaced this presentation, libido theory is what is consuming a lot of Freud's attention and what is really building the foundations of psychoanalysis throughout the first decades of its emergence and maturation. And that involves the elucidation and the removal of nervous disorders in the instinctual life of the mind. I think this term is very important. It's a term that has become more and more central in the papers from this decade. I like the way it's phrased here, the quote unquote instinctual life of the mind. Specifically here, he makes the point that psychology as taught in academic context gives a meager reply to matters of instinctual mental life. You could say here in modern terminology that psychology is disembodied. I think it's stronger and clearer to say that psychology needs to focus on the instinctual mental life. As we've covered in previous workshops, specifically here, I'm thinking about the workshop on instincts and their vicissitudes. We should always recall that in psychoanalysis, what is being worked with are ideational representations of instincts. In other words, we're not working with the instincts themselves, the noumenal realm of instincts, as Freud conceives it, but the way in which we come to know instincts through our mind, through our psyche. And in this instinctual life of the mind, we basically have a split or a conflict. Freud is a thinker of conflict. Freud is a thinker of tension. And this continues throughout his entire career. This initial conflict, this initial tension is between the sexual instinct or the libido and the ego instincts or the individual. Here we have let's say, a conflict of interest or a conflict or a contradiction in aim. The libido has let's say, a species-wide aim, whereas the ego has a self-preservation aim. And it is the conflict between the ego and the libido where we get the neuroses. Now, following Freud's own observations over the first decades of his career, basically everyone is some degree neurotic. Basically everyone has some sort of psychoneurotic fixation, phobia, obsession, precisely because it's impossible to get a perfect mix, or it's impossible to get a perfect synthesis between the ego instincts and the sexual instincts, that we are all to some degree struggling with the instinctual mental life. So the first discovery here focus on the neuroses as specific disorders of sexual function and the possibility of satisfying it. What becomes obvious is this impossibility of perfect satisfaction, the impossibility of full satisfaction. There is always an irreducible non-satisfaction or a negative satisfaction, which becomes a key, and I don't want to jump ahead of Freud's own thought here, but which becomes a key to thinking about the death drive, and which becomes a key to thinking about the beyond of the pleasure principle, but we're not there yet. What we're dealing with right now are incompatibilities of our own capacity to deal with this, let's say, impossibility of perfect satisfaction of our instinctual drives. So the therapeutic effort here is where psychoanalysis situates its attention and its aim. Psychoanalysis as an institution or as a method is lodged within this conflict, is paying attention to this conflict. He says the greatest success is with neuroses, proceeding from the conflict between ego and sex instincts. And he'll go so far as to saying that there are dimensions of psychological disorders, specifically the non-transference neuroses, which are beyond analytic attention. Specifically in this decade, I feel like he pays the most attention here to narcissism as a psychological disposition, which is not moralized, but something which points beyond what he's come to see as the talking cure in the therapeutic context. He says, in regards this conflict between the ego and the sex instincts, the ego defends or denies the sexual instinct satisfaction and forces them to substitute satisfactions where we get the nervous disorders. Most notably here, we can have obsessions, neurotic fixations, which are substitute satisfactions for the actual sexual instinctual satisfaction, and can come to disturb the individual's capacity to function or to bear its existence, in short. The treatment here is in regards to the distribution of the patient's libido, consequently. It's a look for the object presentations of which the libido is bound and to free it from these object presentations and replace it at the disposal of the ego. So it's basically trying to help the ego come to terms with libidinal concentrations of energy, what Freud frequently refers to as cathexis, and to help the ego more, let's say, adequately adapt to the reality of its body and the reality of its psyche as a totality. And this will become more clear when we get into basically Freud's letter to the ego, telling the ego basically what psychoanalysis is effectively saying in a common layman's terms type of approach. Ultimately, right now, though, he's going to try to paint a picture for us about the consequent picture of what all this means for the human being, metaphysically, metapsychologically, as it relates to the primal distribution of libido in humans. We get a different picture of human nature. We get a different picture of let's say, fundamental psychology. Specifically, in the beginning, Freud says all libido or all erotic tendencies are tied to the self, its own cathexis, its own ego. Only later does the libido flow over from the ego to external objects. So what we have here is basically, again, this primal narcissism. You could even say a type of absolute narcissism. And he will even go so far to extend his theory of dreams, which perhaps we'll get to in a future workshop, to say that the dream or the sleep state itself is something that has an aim towards absolute narcissism. It's basically, when we get analysis, we are getting a situation where this primary attachment to the self flows over onto external objects, and there are asymmetries, gaps, problems with the fixations on objects. Basically, this is where the individual is struggling to come to terms with its, let's say, subordinate position in regards to the libidinal field, the libidinal energy, however you want to talk about it. The individual advances from narcissism to object love, but even in highly developed object love, Freud says narcissism persists. In other words, we never totally get rid of our primal narcissism. That's something very important, I think, to think about, is that you can't escape yourself. The fact that we have a primal starting condition in this very self-centered type of being is not something that we can fully escape through, for example, flights of the ego. We have to go through this. We have to confront this within ourselves. And I think many spiritual masters or spiritual teachers are ultimately trying to confront this reality and developing methods for how to approach this reality. In any case, the ego libido to object libido, ultimately here, Freud starts to identify a third movement, let's say, that it's not simply just ego libido to object libido, but it's also this recoil back to ego libido, and that complete health should not lose the full mobility of the capacity of the ego libido to extend itself to the object libido and then go back again to the ego libido. Basically here, he's trying to identify a dynamism, a mobility of what he says is a full mobility. Oftentimes what happens for adults is that their ego libido flows over onto an object, and becomes fixated on this object in such a way as that it loses mobility and potentially loses connection to self. So the capacity to extend one's libido beyond oneself and to withdraw back into oneself is what Freud says is necessary for quote unquote complete health. The metaphor he uses is the metaphor of an amoeba, which is not the first time he uses this metaphor. And I think what's very important to point out as it regards to the extension of Freudian theory in what many people who come to this workshop are focused on with Lacanian theory is that Lacan will also frequently use this metaphor of the amoeba, specifically to talk about libido. And some of the most interesting ideas in Lacan here are invoked, in my opinion, with this metaphor of the amoeba, which we can see here has its origin in Freud's own writings. He gives the idea of the amoeba as this vicious substance that puts out pseudopodia, extends and retracts. You can see in the image there this extension of itself, and then if they can extend and also retract back into itself. This is actually an interesting yet creepy image of what humans are doing in, I think, social life. If you imagine all of humans as these amoebas that are sending out pseudopods into almost extending their libidos onto objects, of course, in intimate relationships. This is what we're dealing with when it comes to transference dynamics. Libido theory is valid for normal behavior, he says, that we can apply it to the narcissism of small children. If anyone's ever been around a small child, the first thing you'll notice is that the child needs all of the attention on it. The child is the center of the universe. The child is the center of gravity. And this continues to go on for many years until the child starts to mature and realize that there are others and that it needs to share space with other people for attention, and it has to put in effort to listen and to respond to what other people are saying and to really develop a theory of mind of the other person. He also says that this excessive narcissism is observable in quote unquote primitive man, specifically as it relates to the belief in the omnipotence of thought. There are some incredibly interesting anthropological stories of specifically colonial contact with human beings who had never encountered advanced technological civilization before. And this expression of the belief in the omnipotence of thought is, I think, evident in some of their behaviors. Of course, here Freud is extending psychoanalysis into observations of anthropological import, which is something that he takes more and more liberties of doing throughout, I would say, since the publication of Totem and Taboo, I suppose. In any case, he then moves on to talk about the sciences and says that libido theory has consequences here, namely in regards to adding yet another egoic humiliation as it relates to humans not being in the center of the universe. So, of course, we know from Copernicus, and Freud references also ancient thinkers like Pythagoras, who dispelled the illusion that the earth is in the center. Of course, this is following a naive sense perception. Again, the importance of, for example, having some basic dialectical understanding of sense perception, as we learn with studying, for example, the phenomenology of spirit in Hegel. But this whole idea of humans at the center of the universe that is derived from our earliest sense perception is something that represents the first egoic humiliation for Freud. This egoic humiliation is extended with Darwin, specifically that man is not the center of life, that there is no sharp distinction between man and animals, but rather a continuity. Freud actually stays very firm with this. In that sense, I think that there is a underappreciated and unacknowledged unity between Darwin and Freud, and understanding the context of the evolutionary sciences and Darwin specifically as opening the possibilities for a psychoanalysis. And again, that this is an underappreciated relationship that I think does require more attention. And in Freud's later work specifically, I'm thinking here of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he develops ideas related to the drive for perfection, which dispel this distinction between man and animals in an interesting way, which I think is also worth paying attention to. Man is not the center of his own mind. This is now the third ego accumulation. In other words, we are not in control of a transparent ego. The mind is rather a complex labyrinth, a psyche or a mind that is mostly unconscious, not conscious, and that the mind must confront this reality when it comes to the neuroses, the mind and other mind diseases, that the ego feels uneasy and comes up against limits to the power within its own house. So here we have the cosmological decentering, the biological decentering, and now the psychological decentering, which Freud is here basically trying to situate psychoanalysis as a major thought innovation in the history of Western science, and basically trying to make metapsychological, metaphysical claims here as it relates to the position of psychoanalysis in history. He says psychoanalysis sets out to explain these disorders, engages carefully with laborious investigations on the neuroses, that it speaks to the ego. And this is now the part of the paper where it gets very interesting. Here we get Freud basically talking to the general ego as if, trying to communicate to the professionals of his day why they should pay attention to psychoanalysis, and why the discoveries in psychoanalysis have a universal importance. He says here, part of the activity of your own mind has been withdrawn from your knowledge and command, that you are weak in defense, that you are using part of your face to fight the other part, and cannot wholly concentrate. He's trying to communicate the axiom that we have covered many times before in this workshop, of the fact that consciousness and the psyche are not the same thing. And it's on this distinction which I think the discovery of the unconscious rests, that consciousness is but a small system within a larger system that we call the psyche, and that system includes the unconscious, that system includes the preconscious and the conscious, of which the consciousness, and specifically conscious perception, is but a small system within that larger system. He says, you have overestimated the strength. You have overestimated strength. Thought you could treat your sexual instincts as you liked and ignore their intentions. Here we're talking about repression, we're talking about defense, and going back to the very first papers that Freud writes on the distinction between sex and ego instincts, where the ego is linked here as a defensive mechanism. He will go on in later papers to talk about dimensions of the ego that are not defensive in nature. And again, narcissism is here a key and a clue to dimensions of ego instincts which are not defensive. But nonetheless, most of the ego is a type of frustrated defense against the sexual instincts, and the ego doesn't like to come to terms with dimensions of itself which it finds either repulsive or unbearable or contradictory or incompatible with the rest of its professional life. So sexual instincts have established rights in a manner you cannot improve, that you cannot approve, and that is the symptom you suffer. You do not recognize it as a derivative of your own rejected instincts. A symptom is a substitute satisfaction. So basically here, Freud's saying that there are parts of your mind that are expressing thoughts and speech and developing fixations and attachments which you find that need censorship, that you cannot approve of, and you cannot stop these thoughts. You cannot stop these expressions. You cannot stop these images, and yet it is because these dimensions of your mind are substitute satisfactions for parts of you that you are not willing to accept. You're never really going to come to terms with your quote unquote true self or truer expression, that you are wasting energy and wasting time and attention because you are split from within. You go on to regard what is mental as identical with what is conscious. A great deal more goes on in the mind. So again, this emphasis here on the split between the mental and the conscious are not the same thing. The mind or the psyche is a much broader term in Freud's understanding. The conscious is much smaller and less important than pre-Freudian psychology assumed it to be. And this really is an important point that I really want to hammer home, because it's all too common today to even hear of modern philosophers and modern psychologists who place much too great of an emphasis on consciousness. And here Freud saying that this is really what needs to be overcome. In instinctual conflict, your intelligence service breaks down. News reaching consciousness is incomplete. Often you only get news when events are over, and you can no longer do anything to change them. This is a line of thinking which he'll continue to extend and play with, of almost as if there is an entire society of mind inside of the psyche. And many of the inhabitants, many of the wills and drives inside your own mind, you are not aware of, and you do not have complete information about. And yet they do operate inside of you. They do have impulses, they do have wants, they do have needs and cravings. And we need to pay attention to these if we are really interested in the instinctual life of the mind, if we are really interested in a full understanding of psychology. To continue on this train of thinking, who can tell all that is stirring in your mind of which you know nothing and are falsely informed? You behave like an absolute ruler who is content with information supplied by the highest officials. You never hear what goes on among the people to hear their voice. Turn inward, look into the depths. So again, this idea of the society of mind, and again, this idea of the ego as a type of absolute ruler. Here I'm getting this idea that inside of us, we all have the potential in our egos, especially in an unreflective ego, to become tyrants, to become our own individual king, without awareness of the entire population of our mind, so to speak, without an awareness of working through all the contradictory voices inside our own head. And I think it's actually this working through the contradictions inside of our own head and questioning our own unity of consciousness, where we have the possibility to become dialectical selves, where we have the possibility to really take the process of psychological maturation to a new level, let's say. It says, on this, psychoanalysis has sought to educate the ego, but the ego is not the master. So basically saying here that you thought you were master of your own house, you thought you had transparent, full information about yourself, and you don't. And that is, in some sense, disturbing. You can understand why so many people resist psychoanalysis. I just actually watched a presentation by a psychologist who took 9 years of university training in psychology at various levels of development, including the doctoral level. And the entire institutions either misrepresent Freud or ignore Freud totally, that there is no real understanding of the unconscious in many of the contemporary disciplines. And that's even what first made me gravitate towards psychoanalysis, was specifically being exposed to cognitive science and being exposed to academic psychology and feeling as if it was incredibly naive as it related to the reality of these dimensions that Freud's here trying to center our attention. The life of sexual instincts cannot wholly be tamed, and here's where all the problem is. Mental processes are in themselves unconscious, so we're dealing with a phenomena which does not have a, let's say, a complete solution. We're dealing with a phenomena that is basically, as we'll get to in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, a binding problem. There's a binding problem, and there is what Alenka Zupancic will call a wandering excess. And this wandering excess cannot be tamed by the ego. That the ego is here has to be thought of as subordinate to these sexual instincts. You could think about this as the species mind is more important than our individual minds. That's one way to look at this, that there is a will of the species mind, of the drives, which transcend our own individual interests. The ego does not look favorably on psychoanalysis and obstinately refuses to believe in it. Again, this resistance to this knowledge is extremely strong, but it's a weird thing. It's like a chicken and the egg thing, because it's like, yeah, how to institutionalize something with egos who are basically going to perceive this as an attack on their own identity, that are going to perceive this as undermining their own self-interests and making them confront emotions that they may not be willing or ready to take an awareness of. Hopefully we'll be able to get to this in a future workshop, but there is a paper that Freud wrote on the nature of teaching psychoanalysis in universities. And I would like to cover that to fully think about the way in which we might approach teaching psychoanalysis to the larger public. Lots to think about there. And this is, I think, the final slide, that Freud offers us a philosophical link between what was developing in the last half of the 19th century and what psychoanalysis was becoming in the early 20th century, that of a link between Arthur Schopenhauer's notion of an unconscious will and the mental instincts of psychoanalysis. For those of you interested in German idealism, I think that there's also a link here with Schelling's work. I think there's also a link with Hegel's work. And of course, there's a link also with Nietzsche's work. But we can think of these philosophers as forerunners to the understanding of the mental instincts of psychoanalysis. And here we get a very clear description that Freud himself was a fan of Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer was a thinker who admonished mankind of its underestimated importance of its sexual craving. And certainly this is very much in line with the message that Freud stumbles upon in his formulation of psychoanalysis. However, he says that psychoanalysis has an advantage over Schopenhauer's philosophy insofar as that it is not only an abstract understanding, but rather touches personally on every individual potentially. That being that psychoanalysis is a clinic and has clinical application as it regards to the problems that emerge in the tension between the ego and the sex instincts. And again, just to remind you that links to my Patreon, Philosophy Portal, and my PhD thesis, Global Brain Singularity, are in the link below. And just the special new announcement that there is a Freudian Unconscious course that is available for the first time and with new material. So look for that if you're interested. And thank you so much for paying attention. We can get into a broader conversation. So just raise your hand if you'd like to talk, and then we'll just we'll go through the motions.
Thanks for the presentation.
Mika!
I'm here. A question that came to my mind while reading this was that what do you think that the neurotic wants?
What's that? What does the neurotic want?
Yeah.
Well, can the question be answered generally? I mean, I think that the way I understand it is that there's a split. It feels split from its, I suppose, self-centeredness. I mean, that's what Freud repeatedly points back to, is this almost absolute narcissism. That the neurotic wants, I suppose, a symmetry with the external object, and it goes to, at least, so like, let me just think about it from my personal point of view. I've gone to analysis twice, and both times that analysis was provoked by a problem with an external object in the context of dating and in the context of a fatherly figure. So in the context of both situations, there's a sort of libidinal dissatisfaction and ultimately a confrontation with a motive that seems to me to be narcissistic in essence. That's my personal relationship to the theory.
But what's the difference? Right. What's the difference between the question of what the neurotic wants and what anybody wants? I mean, why is the neurotic?
Yeah, I think that the question is
separating those questions.
Yeah,
I think Freud's saying that everyone is neurotic.
I can explain it in the way that Freud is focusing on
but I mean, why
specifically neurotic structure.
Neurosis? The idea is of libido. So the idea of libido is what everybody wants, which is sexual satisfaction. So the question is, in what way does the neurotic differ from anybody else who is seeking sexual gratification?
Yeah, that's man in the Heideggerian sense, to anybody. But I think that the question is worth remarking because Freud is focusing on specifically neurotic issues in this paper. And Freud seems to be leaning towards a normalizing tendency here in certain ways. He seems to be thinking that the therapeutic goal or the success is a place where there is no more so much a conflict between the ego drive and the sexual drive, but a certain type of normalization or even perhaps an adaptation to a reality within and reality without. And here I think that it's an open question if this picture of therapeutic goal fits to what the picture of the neurotic then on the other hand is.
I think he just from my readings again of I place so much emphasis on beyond the pleasure principle is that this whole idea to normalize and get rid of the conflict between the ego and the sex drive, I think he totally abandons this in beyond the pleasure principle and basically points towards this irreducible conflict between what he starts to call the life and the death drives.
Yeah, and the way that you gave the picture of ego as well, you seem to think of it as a frustrated agency of defense against sexual instinct. And I'm not sure if this picture fully fits what Freud is giving about the conflict between sexuality and ego. maybe the idea of a frustration here is leaning towards the idea that there is a certain conflict which generates sometimes a frustration, but not always. I think that the notion of perhaps generating a friction or generating heat, even one could say, is essential here.
Yeah, I think that, at least again from my reading of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he does start to point towards the idea that the ego is not merely defensive and not merely frustration. And he says that this is something that needed to be modified from the early manifestations of libido theory. But that there are other dimensions of the ego.
Cadell, before you move on to later history, the beginning in his 1908 paper, which I quoted in that paper, I think that I just published on my newsletter, was that sexual repression was the cause of sexuality. Wherever there was a problem, it was due to the repression of sexuality. So that's where Freud started out, right at the beginning in 1908. It was not a complicated theory. It was.
But things get more complicated.
Well, but I mean, you have to start to where he began. You can't move 10 years later because of fundamental psychoanalytic theory. And this extended to like Norman O'Brien when he wrote about the resurrection of the body. And that was written in 1959, that the problem was precisely that man was not in touch with his instincts, if you want to put it that way. That this was the fundamental question of psychoanalysis. Why does are human beings, not only men, not in touch with their drives, their instinctual drives? And as you say, an instinctual drive meant a combination between the somatic experience and the mental representation. And that's where the fantasy comes in. So you have the somatic drive, and that every adolescent knows about that. It's based on testosterone or estrogen or whatever, and 14 years old get erections when they're sleeping and actually all the time. And then there's the mental representation, which is the object of one's desire, so to speak. And these two things go hand in hand, so to speak.
Yes, but I know that this is originally where Freud's ideas start, but I'm just trying to point towards the fact that later on Freud comes to understand that this relationship is actually more problematic and actually a lot darker than a lot of the thinkers who perhaps tried to use the early ideas of psychoanalysis as a foundation for a sexual cultural revolution. Things are more complex. Things are actually a lot darker. And I think that becomes clearer when Freud starts to stumble upon this underlying tension between the sexual instincts and the death instincts, that it's not simply that if we get in touch with our sexual instincts that we will have a free, liberated sexuality. This is much too simplistic, and that if you use that as a political program, you run into a whole host of paradoxes and complications, which frankly are, I think, out of touch with the reality of most people's experience of 21st century sexuality.
All right, but the point is that the history of the 20th century was not based on Freud's theory of the death instinct, and that's what I was trying to talk. Who is the most important sexual thinker of the 20th century other than Freud? Can anybody guess?
Enlightenment.
Remember, I'm twice as old as everybody here. Let me make that clear. I'm twice as old. So there's things that none of you have experienced that I experienced in a prehistory, so to speak. Who is the most important sexual thinker of the 20th century?
Well, you're asking this audience. Mika has a vote for Lacan.
This is way before Lacan. Lacan is way later. I'm talking about early history. The
early 20th century?
No, after Freud, in the 50s.
Reich.
Who?
Wilhelm Reich.
He was earlier. Yes, Wilhelm Reich was very, very important as developing Freud's ideas, the function of the orgasm, was his book. And his idea was that if you could have a good orgasm, you would be sexually healthy. But I'm talking out now, and he was profoundly influential in the culture. That was one of the main ideologies of the whole hippie. But I'm talking.
All right, Richard, give us the answer, because I want to get to Eric and Chitin.
Okay, the most important thinker other than Freud was Hugh Hefner.
Okay, that's a good answer.
Well, it is the answer. In the 1950s, most people had not seen a nude woman in any way. Okay, so 1954, that magazine originated, and as Gay Talese wrote about, that was the first time that most people had seen a nude woman. It was Marilyn Monroe that became the symbol of that sexual revolution, which began with Hugh Hefner. There was one other magazine that I used to buy before Playboy magazine, and that was Sunbathing for Health. So the only way you could see anything about sex was to pretend that it had to do with the health movement. So that evolved from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And I was thinking of the name of the nightclub. Does anybody remember the nightclub from 1978? Not Plato's Retreat, but the disco revolution was the manifestation of this Freudian idea. Norman O'Brown, the last chapter of his book was called The Resurrection of the Body. And this was very difficult work. And yet, when I was at the New School, who did I meet reading that book? Louise Lasser, who was Woody Allen's first wife. So the book had a tremendous influence on the 60s. And that's when the sexual revolution began, but it didn't reach its peak until 1977. And if you know the songs of that time, like Donna Summer's, all the songs revolved around, come on, baby, do it, take your time, do it right, you can do it, baby, do it tonight. And
all right, Richard. I want to make sure I get to some other people with their hands up. So, okay. But thanks for contributing there. Eric, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to try to answer Mika's question. What does the neurotic want? I think it's an important question. And by focusing upon the notion of the neurotic, focusing upon structure, because Lacan asked this question, and he presents two questions: the question of the hysteric, and the question of the obsessional. And in a sense, the hysteric is, I think, is the foundational question. Everyone's is a little hysterical. Hysteria is, I think, the baseline neurosis that even obsessionals share to a degree, and that is, of course, Kevoy in the graph of desire. What does the other want? What does the big other want? What the neurotic wants is to be the desire of the other. The obsessional, that question is am I alive or dead? And another question that frames this for the hysteric is am I a man or a woman? Now these questions I think are interesting because they're not axiomatic necessarily. We don't know, we wouldn't naturally come to these questions, but I think they all have something to do with what Freud is pointing out in this text here with his analogy of the amoeba, and he says. Just prior to that, we do not believe that the whole of the libido ever passes over from the ego to objects. A certain quantity of libido is always retained in the ego, even when the object love is highly developed. A certain amount of narcissism persists, and I think this is precisely where we find this uncertainty in the neurotic. One of the things that defines neurosis is uncertainty, doubt. Where we see this in psychosis is there's a certainty of feeling, a certainty of an idea, whereas in neurosis, the position of the other, the enjoyment of the other is uncertain. And so there is this constant reality testing, this putting out of the pseudopodia in order to test whether or not precisely this, whether the libido can be successfully transferred into or onto a particular object. And so what the neurotic wants is that full transfer of the libido, but there is always a limit. There's always a point at which that fails, and some uncertainty remains. And so this damming up of the libido, as he will call it in other texts, this failure to fully let it flow out into the object is what can create symptom formations. And I find it very helpful, I think, to pick up a lot of what Hegel talks about in terms of his idea of the determination of finite being and the concept of the limit that lies at a common border between being and non-being, between finitude and its negation. And I'll leave that for another discussion, but it's very, very interesting to think about these ideas in tandem. But here I just want to, in summary, to think that the question of the neurotic, what the desire of the neurotic is, I think, to find a holy land where one can fully invest that libidinal energy. But the problem is this doubt of where that is, and how one can maneuver oneself in order to fully be able to libidinally cathect.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Eric.
Yeah,
that's brilliant. Thank you for that.
If I may shortly continue on this neurotic terrain here. Well, the question itself is a bit ambiguous in the sense in which the neurotic is a split subject between, a neurotic symptom is always for Freud sort of like a compromise formation between various conflicting or contradictory aims or drives. So what the neurotic wants in his or her own daily egoic life of consciousness is just certain, maybe to take a easy example, certain protective measures. They are constantly enacting protective measures against something, trying to keep something at bay and trying to make something into a less of a threat or something like that. So think, for example, about somebody who would be protecting themselves from going to open spaces, from getting too exposed or something. And it's a common example of agoraphobia. And what they then, in their this normal egoic way of going about of things, want is something that produces for them feeling of anxiety, feeling of hostility, feeling of frustration, and so on. All these things that they do not know that they produced for themselves. So there is a desire for a good. They want the good, if we would be inclined to say so. But what they get is instead a suffering. A neurotic symptom produces certain desire, which is disavowed, or sorry, enjoyment or jouissance, which is disavowed by the ego. It's seen as as Freud says here, it's an alien guest. It's something that comes for the neurotic almost like without, from an alien source. And in neurosis, there seems to be, that Freud is pointing out, a greater emphasis on sexuality than on the ego itself. So Freud is seeking for the therapeutic way for the neurotic in focusing on sexuality. But what this focus on sexuality achieves, it's an open question always.
Don't you have to start with libido? What is sex? Very simple. All these stuff is much too abstract. You start with libido. What is libido? And as the girls in the street talk about, or the cam girls, they have a term called horny. This is where you have to start if you want to talk about sexuality before you go into these gigantic flights. You have to start with sexuality as a form of excitement and libido, the bodily sources. So you have to define what that is before you start with these grandiose hypotheses.
Well, Richard, with all due respect, everyone who's speaking here has committed a lot of time to studying not only Freud, but also extensions of Freudian theory, which my interpretation of your intellectual background is that you have less understanding of. So just try to be respectful of the other theorists here, because I think, in my personal view, what Eric was elaborating on here was extremely crucial, and I think technically precise, specifically as it relates to the questions of the neurotic and the hysteric.
We're talking about understanding of sex, not understanding of theory. I have plenty of experience in sex, and that's where it starts. Okay, isn't that what Freud talking about? Libido?
Yeah, my most central point here is more a sort of a regulative role as someone who's leading a workshop, that just, if you want to contribute to the conversation, just raise your hand and then I can make sure you have your turn to talk. So just keep that in mind. Chitan, would you like to speak next?
Thank you, Gerald. Okay, so I think there are a couple of things to say on the question that Mika is asking, and almost Eric has said almost everything on the topic, and I don't think much can be said beyond that. But just to sort of add, if you think about what neurotic actually want, if you try and simplify that domain, we would see that neurotic wants some kind of harmony with the real. You know, that's the essential thing that neurotic is seeking for. The problem in that scheme of things always is that neurotic is always dealing with substitutive satisfactions. And that's the challenge, to think that how do we think about substitutive satisfaction when we cannot have any ground zero full satisfaction? I guess that is where the actual the heart of the problem lies with sexuality. I remember Lardin Dolar sort of having a talk, and this goes back to Richard's point actually. When initially when Freud's sort of movement started, people actually thought that as we get liberated with sexuality, we'll also get emancipation from capitalism. And as we see that history unfold, we know that there is no correlation there. There is no correlation between liberation from sexuality in that sense, and emancipation from any of the social, and which is why, as Kedil was pointing out to us, that politically it may be a very disastrous proposition to think that sexuality can liberate you in that sense. And later on, Lacan's own thinking upon this actually, sort of if you move from taking neurosis as simply a disease which you need to cure for, and take it as a structure, we realize that with sex, what we are not seeking is full satisfaction at all. And that is where I think one can actually push Eric back a little and ask this question in some serious way, that is neurotic actually seeking full satisfaction with the object itself or not? Or is there something in the neurotic itself that he knows that he's seeking something for a substitute? And all any psychoanalytic treatment can do is modify the subject's relationship vis-a-vis his own neurosis. Or is there a genuine desire for full satisfaction behind it, which is functioning over there? I'm not saying it isn't there. I'm just saying that question goes up for the grabs. Minute we articulate that split and I think one of the things that I realized while reading this paper is that what Freud is trying to show to us is that essentially failure is the norm of this movement of the unconscious. Unconscious emerges from itself a failure. There's always a gap between subject's relationship with his reality. And there is bound to be a failure in all those cause and effects games that he's going to play. And unconscious can only be found in that failure. But if failure is the norm, and if he accepts failure as the all-pervasive thing, then is there a point of success over there or not? Is there a point in how do we articulate, and today's question actually is the reverse one, how do we articulate a conscious subject? Is consciousness there in ego? It is there in pre-conscious? It is there, where is conscious, where is awareness located in that sense? And if he thinks through that problem, I think to its end, we get down to why love is becoming as a concept so important today, because love can articulate that relationship with reality, which can actually include a neurotic structure and yet give you a certain way to modify that structure vis-a-vis different social, cultural, political orientations and so on and so forth. I'm not sure. I think anybody else can think through it better.
Yeah. Okay, great line of thinking there, Chetan. I'm again just pulled back to specifically thinking about the beyond the pleasure principle, where there's basically what he seems to point to is online is this reconciliation with a constitutive non-satisfaction, and that a neurotic sort of going into an acceptance of failure mode is a sort of a recognition that its idealized object is ultimately impossible.
Yeah, and I would like to make a small point, important point here. It's all happening within speech. It's not like Freud is recommending for you to go and release your libido in masturbation or in coitus, although that might be good for some people if they are really obsessional compulsives in some cases. But what is happening is the failure in speech through which a truth can emerge, and truth is here something that might revitalize in the sense of bringing the libido back into action within speech. I mean, yeah.
Okay, can we get to Sahil? Are you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Carol. I'm just thinking in the line of thought that Eric and Chetan also were trying to discuss. I'm just wondering, Freud here also talks about rule in the sense that there is a notion of sovereignty and there is a notion of the amoebic species mind, both coming together. I'm just wondering if we were to think of the mind, as a political analogical structure, and then think through this challenge of the tussle between ego and object love from a lens of sovereignty of maybe what Chetan is saying, the awareness and the consciousness. I'm not sure, but I'm just trying to think through this because I found that word peculiar there, trying to rule over. And it brought in this notion of like another way of looking at this, from a more Deleuzian perspective would be that, there are these machinic movements going throughout the body as rhizomatic structures, and then you're trying to find a way to bring them together. They are obviously all pulling in different directions, and you're trying to see how that tussle plays out, and that could be then leading to a neurosis as the unconscious and whatever is perceived as a conscious struggle. But again, these are musings.
Yeah. No, these are great questions, and I do have, I think, hopefully something meaningful to say here in response to it. So, as far as I'm aware of the development of Freud's thought, there's this, like you're saying, this tussle between ego and object love, which is basically manifesting in the sex and the ego instincts. And yes, it's true that Freud is recognizing some sort of, you could say, Deleuzian mechanical movement, rhizomatic structure. But where that all turns into, I think, a problematic political, let's say, metaphysical totality, is that it ignores the fact that you can't get rid of this irreducible tension, which Freud starts to identify in the life and the death instincts. So in other words, just by freeing the rhizomatic structure or the multiplicity or, you know, the amoebic mind, you do not from that, let's say, release, get a coherent political or a social structure which can, let's say, meaningfully function in any way. So that's at least how I understand it. But I really appreciate the way you're framing your question and your interest, because I think it's of the highest importance that we're able to bring this rhizomatic structure to consciousness and learn how to, let's say, work with a new type of tension, which I think is not a tension between ego and object love, but I think between, I would say, life and death itself. And that's anyway the way I don't know if that exactly answered or at least points in a meaningful way to you. Okay, but I'll go to Eric and then Alexandra.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. I just wanted to respond to Chetan, who was brilliant in his retort. First of all, I want to directly answer his question, or his comeback to me, and I think he's right, and I think when I say that I still think there is a search for a full satisfaction, but what one discovers in the failure to find the full satisfaction in the object is that the full satisfaction can only be had, as it were, by sustaining the drive itself. Right?
Yes.
And so this is where the death drive comes into play, is that by sustaining the failure, that is the only way that the libido can, in a sense, stay in motion, stay in flux. What Freud tends to not, or what he thinks to be psychopathological, is the damming up of the libido. You know, this point where it becomes stuck, and what, you know, can allow it to flow is either some kind of object cathexis or the death drive itself, this constant repetition of that. You know, and so we could even liken, I think, the Fort Dage of Freud's grandson to this metaphor of the amoeba. You know, isn't there something akin to the throwing of the spool and its recovery to the putting out of the pseudopod, you know, and its retraction, this constant you know, test of trying, you know, I don't know, there's something there, I think. I'm still kind of thinking about that, but Chetan also said something else that I think is really, really great. It was something to the effect of, that we're really trying to reconcile ourselves with the real. And I was thinking, and this is just kind of, I'm just going to put this out there for those who want to study this on their own. But in one of the sessions of Lacan's Seminar 24, it's the session of the 18th of January, he makes the comment of how the imaginary can be a continuation of the real in a way that kind of short circuits the symbolic. And it's very cryptic, and he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about it, but it's worth kind of following up on, because what tends to happen here, and try to bring this back to Freud, is that in this attempt to reconcile the imaginary and the real, the ego and the object, okay, what we tend to do is search for a signifier, something in the symbolic that can mediate the imaginary and the real. And that tends to be where that libidinal cathexis lives, within the space of the signifier. That is the phallic jouissance. But I think there is, in Lacan's late theorization here, a more direct line between the imaginary and the real that can short circuit this symptomatic signifier or symbolic. But anyway, that's for a later study. But Chetan's brilliant remark there brought that to my memory.
Thanks, Eric. And I just want to just emphasize just how I just think how important this conversation space is to not only sort of discuss Freud's original writings, but also to have the space for these higher theoretical reflections that touch on modern philosophy. So thank you both, Eric and Chetan and Mika and everyone else for contributing in that way. Alexandra?
Hi, I will say sisters and brothers.
And sisters and brothers, yeah.
Yeah, because I'm after my Omicron, so I'm so happy to be back again. So thank you, first of all, Kadel, because what you are doing here is just to be a space holder for all of us. And I think you are capable of being a space holder because you are not fixated, you are not binded totally, you are not identified totally to your ego. So that's why you are able to create a free space in which you can give us the opportunity to manifest. Why I'm saying that? Because I'm comparing you with the ego, with the narcissistic ego. That's the problem of this incapacity of not being elastic, not being in a free movement from, from object to yourself, to the ego. You are not capable because you are fixed, you are attached, you are identified. And then we have wars because we don't have this free space that you are so generous giving us in this meeting. So that's one of the reasons I think why Freud is telling us about this elasticity. Even if we are never totally able of detaching from our ego, still we get through life this, and through philosophizing, we get this capacity of not being identified anymore so strong to the ego. Okay, what I would like to say to Eric and to ask him, he was talking about the doubting dimension of the neurotics. So I'm asking him, neurotics are Cartesians? Because the doubt is enforced by Descartes, I think. this doubting capacity. He brought it. Then to Mika, what's the desire? What wants a neurotic? I would like to maybe it's a little too strong what I'm saying now, but after a pandemic experience, I had an insight that for the neurotic, what the neurotic needs is feeling safe. The neurotic is incapable of being on his own. He needs a common sense. He needs to share a common sense with a community, because if he is not identified with a common sense, if he is not capable of being part of something like a community, like a normality, he gets angry, he gets frustrated, he gets anxious. So that's what I think, that it's very important for a neurotic to feel safe. It's much more important than for a psychotic. For a psychotic, the feeling of safety is not so important. It's more important the feeling of free manifestation in a way, or of, I don't know, but not this safety. Okay, and of course, we could see how these structures, irrational, unconscious structures, manifested in pandemic times. Psychotic structures and neurotic structures too. Of course, being very argued by logical, reasonable arguments, but that's another thing. And of course, we can also ask ourselves, and then I finish, we can ask ourselves, because that's what Freud is making here, a critique of this anthropocentric society. Why are we so anthropocentric? Why it's so important to us to be identified with our narcissistic identity, with our image in the water, with our, why it's so important to us, and why it's so painful to let it go. Because it's about the process of becoming humbled from being so proud of who I am, step by step, letting go these identifications and become humbled in a way. So my question to all of you is, what do you think? What's the ontological nature of ego? What's the ontological nature of a narcissism? Is it real or it's virtual? It's just imaginary? Because René Girard said there is no narcissism. It's just my desire is always the desire of the other. So there is an illusory, imaginary dimension of this ego identity. Freud, on the other side, is saying, no, you always keep something from this. So what's philosophically, ontologically, the nature of narcissism? That's my question, and thank you.
Okay, thanks, Alexandra. I think in there was a question for Eric and a question for Mika. So first I would ask Eric if you were interested in responding to that question about doubt in the neurotic.
Yeah, there was something there about the Cartesian subject. Yeah, it is the Cartesian subject. Lacan makes that very point. In various places, I think Seminar 9, Seminar 24, I think. Yeah, he's definitely isolating, and when he talks about the subject, he's definitely isolating the Cartesian subject there. So yeah, it is the doubting subject. I think that's there is something in the doubt. There is the this focus upon the limit, and I think this is what Lacan deals with in Le Terre. the limit, I think, is really important. Something to do more research on. Where in psychosis there is a direct continuity between the imaginary and the real. In the hallucination, in the voices, the ego is experienced as external. There is no limit, right? And there's a certainty there that what is external, what is of the ego that is in the external object is real. But for the neurotic, there's this very important buffer zone that is the symbolic. And within that symbolic space, then there is a necessary uncertainty. And I think that's where that doubt comes from. And in regard to what she was saying about the ontology of neurosis, it's a very interesting question. Lacan deals with that a bit in Seminar 11. Famously, the question that kind of launches Jacques-Alain Miller into prominence is precisely his question of Lacan's ontology in regard to the unconscious. And Lacan just sort of offhandedly remarks that it is pre-ontological. So it lies somewhere between being and non-being. And I think the reference there to the virtual, to the maybe even to the simulacrum, may be an interesting avenue of thought.
This is I think where Zizek locates less than nothing. I think, but this relationship between the pre-ontological space of being and non-being is where there's not things, but like some other category of virtuality. Mika, Alexander also had a question from Mika as it regards to the desire of the neurotic.
I'll just quickly say one brief thing.
Sure.
In Lacan, the Cartesian subject is very interesting because in I think, therefore I am, the two I's are not same in Lacan, unlike in Descartes.
Well, Lacan will always say, I think where I am not.
Yeah, which is why that formulation emerges, because the two I's are not same.
Yeah.
Where for the first I, the second I is not. I think is a different I, and the I am, therefore I am is a different I. I'm just putting it out there. Yeah.
Yeah, the subject of the enunciation versus the subject of the enunciated, or yeah.
All right. So thanks again, Alexander, for your questions, and also bringing in that I think quite productive relationship to thinking what is the difference between Freud and Girard, and to constantly keep these two figures in some sort of dialectical tension where we can maybe think something new. I like the way you're going in that direction. Mika, did you want to respond directly now, or did you want to wait till?
I don't know. I mean,
and then I
don't have much to say about it. I would like to maybe expand on some other topic.
Okay, well, let's get to Madalena, and then we'll get to you, Mika. Madalena, welcome.
Thank you. I'm totally just crashing the party here. It's my first time, so I caught my attention that this was around this notion of an affective difficulty rather than an intellectual difficulty. And I wanted to sort of zero in on that a little bit more. And what I'd like to throw in is the fact that obviously Freud's thought, like anyone, is a product of a cultural context and a grammar of sense making, which, as Richard pointed out, is pre-Hugh Hefner. So let's say there's a great deal of limitations on the field that he can actually comment and reflect on. And this is not to say that I don't find the tremendous dedication, which I think really comes from this, extraordinary attentional and relational practice, almost like an ethnographic practice of conversation, which was absolutely not available in any other space, besides perhaps, confessional environment, so in that sense, I think bringing us to the question of attention, and the other. And I was just wondering, Cadell, if there's any relevance, and if there isn't, I'm fine if it's outside the scope of this. The notion of the double bind, as being sort of integral to all these quote unquote dualities, and the schismogenetic sort of dynamic that, the amoeba sort of idea, which happens in relation, right? So that the thing is not the identitarian, but it's what happens between, constantly, what happens between. And this starts to eschew these other ontological notions of us being made in the image of God, and therefore having to act like gods and masters of everything, our libido, our emotions. I mean, that was the model, and it's not the model we are working with right now, even in this space. Otherwise, you would have given a lecture and nobody would have commented, So the fact that you opened this space, as Alexandra mentioned, is already kind of evidence of a very different way of engaging with our ability to be affected. So I'm going back to the affective difficulty, because we are being affected in a very, very different way. And I'm curious how you, having launched this, having cultivated this practice, having opened up this space, can perhaps expand a little bit more on that affectability.
Yeah, great. So did you say double mind or double bind?
Double bind. I'm
double
talking
bind.
about. Yeah, the Batesonian sort of double bind that Deleuze and Guattari also pick up. I mean, like they pick up a lot from Bateson without really recognizing, but more in terms of the ecologies of the mind, as rather than, the captain of my soul sort of model.
Yeah. Okay. Great questions, Magdalena. And I mean, that's directed at me. So, I mean, I can give a little bit of a background of I think I know what you're pointing towards. So, let me try and give a little bit of a history of that. So there was an initial frustration with the university environment, which does operate on this ego model. Where there is a kind of one person speaking to many people. And I did find this to be outdated. I did find this to be frustrating. I did find this to be a way in which libidinal concentrations of energy get frustrated and dammed up. And so I was looking for ways to escape such dynamics. My first attempt to get out of these dynamics made use of a triad. So that was in the Sex, Masculinity, and God book, where I tried to hold a space with two other men. And it's basically continued on to trying to hold higher and higher levels of complexity with beyond a triad. And now here there's a real ecology of mind here, which is many people. And at each level of the complexification, it gets harder and harder to, what basically is at stake is how can you include more others while keeping on to a coherent topic, right? Like we're talking about a paper from 1917 written by Freud, and the people in the room who have been gravitating towards this activity are from a certain theoretical background. And I have to try to balance all of these different minds while also sort of making space for otherness. And yes, people who don't have a history with this theory are also welcome to share and come into the space, and people who are completely from a different philosophical background can also contribute. But that takes it's hard to navigate these higher order spaces. And so, but to wrap up quickly, where I make sense of it is that in myself, I have to have a relationship between myself and death. And in order for other people to also work towards contributing in that motion, they also have to work towards that relationship in themselves, because that gets rid of the narcissistic tendency. That's the only thing I could see is getting rid of the narcissistic tendency. And so, and there's so much now, so the trade-offs are, the trade-off is you can lose coherence and you can lose direction, and we can talk about everything and talk about nothing. But the benefit is that it's unbelievable to have a community of mind. And what we want is a community of mind. We don't want one, but at the same time, it does require what Chitan made a joke in our last session, that my internet broke and the session immediately fell apart. And he was like, well, you were the master signifier, so we just disintegrated. So there is a way in which, now this should be understood processually, but there is a need for a type of master signifier. So if I didn't start this, if I didn't organize this, it wouldn't manifest. But it also is about cultivating a space where other people become their own master signifiers. And that's also something that I learned from, because I was trained by other master signifiers. So, but that's to be understood processually and not identified with like in a stupid way, like I'm the ultimate thinker or something. Like that's just ridiculous. But a lot of academic thinkers think like that. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just throw in a little anecdote, because I happen to have had this luncheon with where Sophie Freud was the main guest, and the granddaughter. And I honestly don't remember all she talked about. This was a long time ago, but there was one thing that stuck that I think relates to the kind of space that you're trying to and succeeding at generating. She said that the thing that really had ended up constraining Freud's work and exploration was discipleship. You know, this is the observation of a granddaughter. Mm-hmm. That, I mean, and that doesn't seem like it would happen in this kind of space because of what you're doing and the work you're doing. So, I mean, I just commend you on
well, also what I'm doing is not holding an entity that is as complex as what Freud was holding, because Freud's holding the entire psychoanalytic movement. And well, that's a big thing to be holding.
Yeah, but Cadell, you don't know what movement you're holding. I mean, we are in a time between worlds, and that every one of these interactions has a kind of potential sort of butterfly effect that we have absolutely no idea in each one of the lives that are here in these little rectangles. Because, I mean, to sort of quote Nora Bateson's word, sematicy, the process of mutual learning, it is how an organism learns how to evolve. So you're participating in a co-evolutionary process, you know, and that's very different from what institutions as they've been operating for, you know, especially as they followed an industrialized sausagization of minds, you know. I mean, I'm sort of loosely referencing Augustine, who was so frustrated with language that he said it always comes out one sausage after the other, you know. So, I mean, we I think are deindustrializing imagination in these practices. And that's a co-evolutionary practice. And you have no idea what the ripple effects might be. Thank you.
All right, thanks for your question there. Mika, would you like to continue?
I mean, I don't know, that is so lovely. But I don't know. I mean, I was like planning on making a short exposition of Lacan's explanation of ego in, well, Lacan has this seminar where the second book focuses specifically on the ego in Freud's theory and technique of psychoanalysis. And there are a few comments that I could perhaps make, which connects to what we have discussed so far here. So with regard to the notion that the neurotic would require certain safety, feel at comfort, well, Freud tells us that the neurotic's ego sort of like feels at unease constantly. There are some kind of thoughts emerging from the neurotic doesn't know where. It's sort of like a real invading the imaginary space of the foreign power, an alien force almost. So the neurotic takes all kinds of precautions and measures against this real, which always threatens to invade the imaginary space, keep things at bay, and so on. So I would say that the comfort that the neurotic can achieve in a proper therapeutic setting, it would be just the first step towards what the neurotic wants. And I don't know if there is a simple answer to a question that is itself quite ambiguous. Well, in the second seminar that I was speaking about, Lacan basically makes the point early on that the ego itself is a novel conception. The ego or the self didn't have the same function in pre-modern societies. Lacan thinks in, for example, Socrates and the ancients, they had some kind of conception of central self of some kind, but what intervenes in between is an invention of a what we could call a symbolic machine, or some kind of new structuration, new innovations. I mean, Lacan even connects such things as the invention of a light bulb or Huygens clock. These things affect us tremendously when they are introduced into our symbolic space, into the area in which we live. The fundamental lesson I think that we should take is connected to our reading directly, is the what Lacan calls the decentering of the ego with regard to the subject. He connects this decentering to Rimbaud's, the poet's statement that the self is another geste, or something like that in French. I don't know French, but whatsoever. So the subject is, quoting Freud, not on the same axis as intelligence. It is eccentric. The subject as such, functioning as a subject, is something other than an organism which adapts itself. It's against adaptation, one could even say. And what's happened, why is Lacan speaking at this moment specifically on this topic is the very fact that the ego has become in his time a sort of like a dividing line or a central concept. There is even, I think, a hint in Freud's paper here that the issue could be a sort of strengthening of the ego, making the ego able to conform to the necessities of inner and external life and so on. This model that became central to ego psychologists. But Lacan thinks that in here, in this circle around Freud, what happened was that the meaning of the discovery of the unconscious itself was pushed into background. I mean, nobody talked about the unconscious except for Lacan himself. to be a bit overly simple here, maybe, but what they reverted to was a confused and unitary naturalistic conception of man, of the ego, and by the same token of the drives. This, of course, doesn't work so well when we realize that the ego is not the same as the subject, as the central axis, one could say, states here. What's ultimately, I mean, jumping to the higher points of theory in Lacan here is that there is what Lacan calls an absolute other, what is he calls the beyond of all intersubjectivity at stake ultimately, and what is the radical subject. It's something entirely beyond the intersubjective structure domain of the ego, since the ego itself is nothing but a sort of a collection of various identification points, identifications which persist when they resist, one could say. But when these subjects who come into analysis are brought back to these places of identifications as resistances, as cuts, and so on, what happens is a sort of one could say melting away of the ego, leaving the subject totally floating, one could say, confrontation with what Lacan calls the realm beyond intersubjectivity, which is experienced as an intense fracturing of the experience. He speaks of the fundamentally fragmented image of the body of the discordant subject, and how the ego figures ultimately is a sort of like a nodal point. He doesn't say that it's nodal point, but he says that human knowledge itself in the sphere of consciousness consists in a certain relation to the structure that we call ego, around which the imaginary relation is centered. The ego is what centers certain human knowledges. And the other that the ego is confronting against, this is what we have to really consider as sort of like a lesson against the view that there is just the ego that we need to strengthen to assimilate it in some way to pre-existing reality, since there are these experiences of the radical subject that can emerge and can have certain effects and so on. But also connecting to desire here, the objects are always in human relations desired from the viewpoint of the ego, how they relate to us. We cannot desire without ego. Since everything is always in some way connected to the way that we identify with the image of ourselves, with the self-image as lovable and so on. And the way that we desire things then, Lacan tells that the subject cannot desire, the fragmented, the discordant subject cannot desire without dissolving, without seeing that the object escapes. It's always in a series of infinite displacements, he says. And he is here alluding to what he calls the fundamental disorder of the instinctual life of man, which is a sort of like a fundamental datum, which he takes here from the second topology especially, but yeah. And the tension between the subject and the ego is what he calls the starting point for dialectic for consciousness. But consciousness itself is defined materialistically, in a materialist way, as a reflective plane within the subject in the psychical apparatus. But well, that was a bit of a detour to do. I think it was in place to go a bit into these notions from the second seminar, since it focuses on the ego specifically.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mika. I mean, there's several touch points there in what you're talking about that are really fresh in my mind, because I just gave a presentation on Hegel's chapter on self-consciousness, which I think touches on a lot of the themes that you're bringing up here. In particular, this notion of an absolute other beyond all intersubjectivity, where the ego kind of melts, is, I think, something that is, fundamental and absolutely essential to reflect on for all of us in regards.
But also dangerous.
And also very dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I'm reminded also of is connection to Nietzsche here, since to give a sort of a philosophy 101 here about Nietzsche, is that the reason for why Nietzsche focuses in Beyond Good and Evil on psychology is that he tells that the previous philosophers who tried to give an account of consciousness couldn't. They were too afraid to go into the labyrinths of the mind in their inquiries. Since what they always face is the fragmentation of the self in the experience of drive itself. Freud, sorry, that was a slip, but Nietzsche's sort of phenomenological explanation of the wills of the drives is that in the experience of the drive itself, there isn't a central point of consciousness to which we could somehow attach to our will experience that's fundamentally fragmented. And when we inquire into the life of the drive, into the labyrinths of the mind, we encounter a Minotaur, we see dangerous things, but we fundamentally might alienate from the normal people, from the common sense. And then we might not find a way back, but he does in a way.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And in all of this language, before I'd like to get to Jayati, in all of this language, what's most salient for me right now and what's most interesting to think is all this language of the alien. It's very salient in reading the chapter on self-consciousness. It's also salient in the Freudian text. And I suppose it's also very salient in Lacan as well. And what's at stake here is like a radical, I think we need a philosophy of the alien that really matures our thoughts on, the scientific image of the alien, of this like being from another planet. I think we need to do a proper philosophy of the alien from this point of view. Jayati, would you like to jump in?
Yeah. Thanks, Kettle. So bringing back alien, but in a different language now. There's something I can't wrap my head around, and maybe you guys can help. So there are 2-3 things which are happening here, as I understood. We are looking at neurosis, and we are looking at this conflict which is there between ego libido and object libido. In this paper, he's also then talking about mind, not just about being conscious, but something more than conscious. I was reading on depression, and I was coming across Jung, and I could see underlying Jungian spirit in this particular essay of Freud, specifically where he's talking about thoughts which are coming at times when we are going through neurotic depression or even a depression, which I'm sure we have experienced also. One can be under the grip of the thoughts and such kind of alien things that one just doesn't know from where they come, and they just grip you. I was wondering that this thing of this labyrinth which is there in the mind, and how that is also there, that is also not exactly responsible, but which can be attributed to it. But then when we are looking at the healthy individual, and we are talking about this movement from ego libido to object libido and back to ego libido, and when Jung is talking about the therapeutic value in neurotic depression and going to whatever darkness or the labyrinth that you have, living through the depressions that you have, how do we then understand this movement that is happening? my sense is that of course what Jung is talking about is very much inherent in this movement over here, but that's just my sense of it without knowing much theory. So yeah.
Okay. Are you specifically asking where are Jung and Freud disagreeing on these things, or because you're correct that what we're really zeroing in on this paper is the conflict between the ego and the libido and the mind as not being just consciousness, but also the other systems, pre-conscious, unconscious. And then you bring up this relationship between Jung and Freud. Is there something specifically you're looking for here in their difference?
First of all, a validation, if I'm thinking right. Secondly, okay. It's an existential. My question is more existential in nature, and I'm wondering that when we are thinking of neurosis, when we are thinking of depression, and we are talking about this movement. So, in this particular movement, how do we then locate the role? How do I then understand when Jung is finding a therapeutic value in neurotic depression? Can we find some answers from this piece or some other piece? I don't know if it is making sense, my question.
Well, I don't know if there's anyone here who feels up to answering this question, but I can give it my best shot. Is that in the movement that I interpret Freud to be talking about as a movement that starts with the ego as an object and moves out to an other as an object, there's this possibility of a fixity. So Freud's talking about getting to a place where there's a movement between the ego and the object as a quote unquote healthy mind. That what Jung's talking about as potentially a neurotic depression or the dark night of the soul or going through a darkness could be the process by which the ego experiences the failure of the object and the movement back to itself. So the therapeutic dimension would be and going through the positive of going through the darkness would be the opening up of a more flexible ego. Mm-hmm. That would be my interpretation. So the dark night and the neurotic depression would be the coming to terms with the failure of the object and the maturation of the ego to a more fluid, to a more elastic movement. But I that's just my stab at your question. That's what it invokes in my mind.
Okay. Without answering that question, can I just make some immediate 2-minute remark on it? What I think Jyoti is pointing out to us is an interesting problem with Mika is talking about this alien. Neurotic thoughts actually has a lot of alien stuff built into it. You know, if we think about the neurotic experience, it almost alienates us from ourselves. You know, what Jyoti is trying to ask is, what is so therapeutic about that alienation, I think. Am I right, Jyoti? What makes that alienation so therapeutic? We have some answers to it broadly. I'm not getting to those, but I think that there is something interesting over there, which we can, I think about.
Does anyone else want to also maybe respond or give some thoughts to Jayoti's reflections?
I can.
Yeah. Okay, Alexander, go for it.
We have a philosopher, a Romanian philosopher, Emil Cioran, and he was not always, but he was in depression. He had depression. He was depressed very often. And he said that depression is like a foot in the ass that makes you progress, that makes you go and discover something new, that transforms you. So it's not a mean in itself, but it's let's say an opportunity. Every depression is an opportunity to change. And on the other way, what I would like to say to the very interesting and provocative question of Jayati is that I remember that I read in a psychoanalytic book this idea that the child has different phases, alternating psychotic phases with depressive phases. And in the depressive phase, there is a unification. There is, because in the psychotic, a very small child, in a psychotic phase, there are pieces, fragments. And after that phase, in the depressive phase, there is this capacity of putting them together, creating that progressive ego image. So I think that the depression is good for integrating things. I know Mika loves this word, integration. So integrating fragments, but the price you have to pay for this is sufferance, it's pain, because that's why we hate depression, but because we feel pain more than pleasure. So it's a price. It's a price of sufferance, of pain, that we have to pay in a way for transforming us, for becoming, for individuation, for becoming singularities, I think.
All right. Thanks there, Alexandra. I just want to make sure we get to Eric because he has to leave soon. So you okay with that answer or those reflections there, Jayati? Okay. All right, Eric, let's, stage is yours.
Okay, just one quick thing in reference to Jyoti and the notion of alienation is something of the notion of otherness itself. Hegel makes the point in Science of Logic that our understanding of otherness is from the framework of our own subjectivity, and so the concept of otherness is within the thing itself, within ourselves, and so there is something of the ego that is implanted upon otherness itself. And I think that's important to remember, is that however we conceive of otherness, there's something of our own ego that we cathect into that. And so our whole experience of otherness is inextricable from our own experience of ourself, our ego. But on a wholly different point, Madalena mentioned Bateson's double bind, and it just kind of, the light bulb came on. And I just wanted to make a reference to Lacan's Seminar 5, Formations of the Unconscious, in a chapter called The Foreclosure of the Name of the Father. He references this very concept of the double bind from Bateson, and from a talk gave by Gisela Pankov, where she brings up the point, this example of the double bind, and it's very pertinent to what we're talking about here. If I respond to my mother's declaration of love, I provoke her withdrawal. And if I don't listen, that is to say, if I don't respond to her, I lose her. And I think that's a great picture of this doubt, or this frustration of the neurotic that we've been talking about, and this double bind. If I accept and respond to the declaration of love, then all is satisfied and the mother goes away. But if I refuse to listen, then she also goes away, right? So there's a frustration of the libido in both particular outcomes, and I think this is what establishes the whole framework of neurosis, whether obsessional or hysteric, is this kind of getting caught in this double bind. So I'll have to leave it with that. Thank you, Cadell, and everyone for another wonderful session.
All right, thank you so much, Eric. Alexandra, did you still have your hand up for something separate? No? Okay. All right, then we'll move straight to Chetan.
I'll quickly sort of move from Jyoti's point. I think one thing that thinking about depression actually is that that depression actually are the aggressive instincts that can't be sort of articulated in the libido, isn't it? That they can't find the libidinal outward thing. And I think there's something to be thought about. What is it that a neurotic, especially in his most depressive phases in that sense, discovers within those failures in that sense? There is something about that failure that itself needs to be affirmed. I think that is what Jyoti is bringing to us. It's not simply a failure that we need to overcome and do better and win the next time. Okay, this time my instincts could not reach a certain object, and next time I'll do better and do it right. That doesn't work. That structure itself fails. And I think that's where Jyoti is trying to hint to us, that there is something about the neurotic alienness of the thought itself, and there is aggression there, definitely, and every neurotic structure, symptom experience. Yeah.
Can I respond directly to what you're saying about this structure? Because I agree completely. So like, see how far that our maps match? Is when you're saying this structure of the object fails and it's okay, next time I'll get the object, I'll just do it again, that very structure falls apart. That's what
falls apart.
Yeah. And that's what I would call the fixity of the relationship between the ego and the object. And then it has to become more fluid. And it kind of accepts the gap, right? Like it accepts the gap, it accepts, and that's the condition of the fluidity.
I take your point. That is the condition. That is the condition of the fluidity. I take your point. But that is where Jyoti's question becomes very important, because what she's telling us is, for the fluidity to come, there is something about that alienness of the thoughts, the alienate of the gap itself, that needs to be gone through. Yeah. You can't simply keep on repeating the same thing again and again, thinking, that repetition itself allows more repetition to take place in some senses. And I can get into the theoretical bit of it, but at a very practical level, what a subject is going through is that each time he does something different to overcome it, each time he gets stuck in the repetition. And that fluidity only comes when he completely affirms that he or she completely affirms the repetition. When you completely affirm those alien thoughts as your own, at a very, very practical thinking level, without getting into the theoretical problems of it. And that is where I think the problem of the unconscious emerges very seriously. And I think Lacan has a very interesting thinking about this problem. That unconscious actually emerges not because unconscious itself involves solving of or explaining certain phenomena. In fact, Lacan very easily says Freud can let go of explanation of neurosis through unconscious very easily. The problem for understanding something like neurosis or even psychosis and other mental structures is that you need to think through the very idea of cause itself. Cause comes into play exactly at the point where the simple reasoned rationality fails, where the idea of a law fails, where the idea of a direct consequence, if A happens then B happens, that itself fails. There's a gap in between. That is where Sahel, zygomatic, and all of those questions come back into picture. That there is a failure involved in very connection of two things itself. And unless we have a way to think through that failure, own up that failure in some radical sense, and again, we can get into the theoretical questions, which may take us too long right now. But if we have to think through the challenge that Jyoti is throwing to us, we need to be able to affirm or find a way to think through that failure without actually saying that we can sidestep that failure into some kind of either fluidity, as you're saying, or some ideal relationship with an object, some romantic love, any of these ideas, till the point that they're asking us to sidestep that failure, themselves will fail. And any of these ideas can succeed if they're asking us to affirm that failure.
Well,
in some senses.
In this regard, what I think is interesting is there is I think oftentimes when we conflate we should try not to conflate the differences between big philosophers to the point where we lose the essence of what's important in a more complex geometry of philosophical thinking. But I just want to emphasize that when Hegel starts the phenomenology of spirit, he starts it with the axiom that fear of error is fear of the truth itself. So, and I think that the phenomenology of spirit is basically a guided tour through failure of the object. It's just this constant failure of the object. The object just fails. Every identity fails to the point where you are the negativity itself. And the idea I had was, and I wonder if this is somehow linked to what Sahil put in the chat, because Sahil mentioned difference is pure repetition by Deleuze. What I wonder sometimes is if what Hegel talks about as absolute knowing is somehow related to what Deleuze talks about in difference as pure repetition. I wonder if there's a link there, but that would be very interesting philosophically if there was. Yeah. But I don't know, Chitan, did you want to continue on any other of those thoughts?
I'll not continue because you've said some very interesting questions. But I think we really need to think about, and I was not mentioning Hegel intentionally, you did, so I'll use that. That we need to seriously think about how do we understand this problem of fear of the failure, which is because that is what Eric's question was. When a neurotic wants to completely affirm a desire, what he gets stuck with the fear of the failure each time. What is it that supplements that problem? What is it that comes along with you completely finding full satisfaction? It is the fear of the failure. And we need to somehow find our grip back with this challenge. And that is what every depressive patient will tell you. Every depressive patient fears failing most. That is how you can't, find your way through that whole. Yeah, I just sort of stop here. Yeah, thanks, Kedal. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go Mika, Alexandra, then Sahil, and then we'll close up. And I just want to be mindful of the time here. So, Mika, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I mean, we have to drop from these heights of the absolute subject and so on. But maybe I would like to return to the point about neurosis and the way that Zizek tells us what is at the core of neurosis is really a perturbed or traumatic relation to the father in the end. Zizek tells that there is at the core of neurosis the trauma of an excessively enjoying father who must be betrayed. In neurosis, there is a failed supplation of father enjoyment into a paternal name. Zizek tells the figure of the father remains marked with a traumatic stain of jouissance. And one of the traumatic scenes which brings such distasteful jouissance to the neurotic is the scene of the father either caught with his pants down, that is in an excessive act of obscene enjoyment, or being humiliated. Such scene transfixes the hysteric's gaze, paralyzes him. The encounter with the real of the paternal jouissance turns the hysteric into an immobilized, frozen gaze, like the Medusa's head. So we have to always return to this discovery of the unconscious and to relation to the father and the big other or the mother. All these things are implied in the picture of the unconscious, which is really the failure of the unconscious is thoroughly about a sexual difference only in the Lacanian view. And what the neurotic desires in this situation, in this conflict with the father, or this pinch, one could say, is that the hysterical subject tries in some way to locate a lack in the father, to weaken the father. And the other option is the obsessional one, who perceives the father as weak, as weakened, and the obsessive feels guilty for this and is ready to sacrifice himself for the father and obfuscate his own desire to humiliate in the end the father. And when we are talking about subjectivity here and so on, I mean, Zizek also claims that there is a subjectivity beyond hysteria also. And what we get from traversing the fantasy, I mean, the pure being of drive that emerges after the subject undergoes subjective destitution, Zizek says, is not a kind of a subjectless loop of repetitive movement of the drive, but on the contrary, the subject at its purest. Zizek tells that he's tempted to say that the subject as such is here, saying yes to the drive, precisely to that which can never be subjectivized, freely assuming the inevitable, the drive's radical disclosure of closure, is the highest gesture of subjectivity. It is thus only after assuming a fundamental indifference towards the big other's desire, getting rid of the hysterical game of subjectivizations, after suspending the intersubjective game of mutual misrecognition, then the pure subject emerges. So I think that this was just to place a sort of triad of the father, mother, and the big other, and so on, to this otherwise vital and fertile discussion about the fixation. I mean, I think maybe you, for some reason, I think, emphasize too much the fixations, which I don't find too pertinent in the Lacanian Freudian model of neurosis, which deals with this conflict with the other, with the big other. It's always a figure of the big other and so on, but we don't so much need to focus on mobility, on fixation and relieving the libido and so on, since these figures or the images, they suffice already, I think.
All right, I just want to pay attention to the time. So, and Alexandra and Sahil, and then we'll wrap this up.
Okay, thank you. I just want to add some concepts or signifiers without developing them too much. About what Mika said, brought in my mind how to say it in English, the return of the prodigal son. The return of the prodigal son. We had such day in our Orthodox religion. So this idea that the son returns to the father, to the transcendence, accepting some transcendence, and in a way the ego, letting go the ego, letting go your volition, your identifications, just accepting the gap, the transcendence, let's say. This relation is very important of accepting or resisting to this name of the Father. And on the other side, what I wanted to bring some concepts, because Chetan was talking a lot about repetition. I don't remember very well, but it is in Lacan about automaton and touche, or touche, from Aristoteles, I think. So this repetition is automaton, as I understand. And what brings new this depression of Jayati is getting out from this automaton. It's this touche, but I don't know very exactly what it means. Maybe someone knows. And what I remember from Lacan is that he's telling us about the importance of that gap, of that nothing, of that empty space, for making the permutations, that's the word he's using, permutation of signifiers through displacement, through shift, through condensations. So changing of some chains of signifiers needs an empty space. So without that, there is just repetition, fixation, automaton. So it's very important, this emptiness, as you said, Kader, this in-between space, this nothingness. Without that, we can't change chains of signifiers, because that's the whole work on dreams and on talking cure. This permutation of signifiers, I think.
Yeah, I think at least how I understand the ultimate sort of metaphysics of Lacan is the negative one, or the gap itself, which basically is primary to the two. So like whether we're talking about mobility fixation, whether we're talking about mother, father, whether we're talking about all these binaries, what's primary is the negative one, or the gap. But it's sort of like a certain two are figures of the gap. And like, yeah, I think Mika, for example, was correct to point beyond even this mobility fixation and so forth to the gap itself. And I think that was sort of echoed in maybe a little bit of what Chitan and I were saying about there's something about the gap itself that needs to be reconciled with, or I would say death needs to be reconciled with, or that there's no perfect object, or no, and so forth. So
yeah, but the project of reconciliation is never over. You never really reconcile with the fact of the triadic situation that human beings live in. I think it's more of a limit or mark.
Well, there's kind of, at least how I understand it, and at least how I've sort of shifted at least how I experience my consciousness as is different from when I was in my 20s, is that I really do more and more experience my day-to-day self as already reconciled in the mess of what's going on, even if there is extreme negativity. I'm already reconciled
in terms of the conscious operating, the plane of the conscious.
I'm reconciled with the fact that I'm reconciled with the impossibility of the perfect object. I'm not, there's not some place I'm trying to go. I'm already here.
Aren't you looking for le petit objet A?
But I'm with it now. But anyway, that's how I experience. I'm not, there's still a direction. There's still a,
Are you playing a fully integrated man here?
No, I'm not fully integrated. I'm saying that I'm okay. I'm one with the negativity. I'm okay. Not fully integrated, just okay with the negativity. Like I give the example a few nights ago of I was at dinner with my partner, and we, for the beginning of the meal, we were in an upset mood, and neither of us was talking. But it's okay that you hold that space of that negativity. This is just a space to cultivate. Anyway,
I just quickly say this. The problem of the gap actually is, no matter how you structure the cause and effect relationship, no matter which way you want to construct a cause, whichever way you want to use language to give meaning to the world in that sense, the gap will always represent itself. That gap will always re-emerge. No matter
what'd you say?
No matter how you structure the cause and effect relationship.
Yeah.
No matter how you want to give language to the world in that sense. The problem is that gap will always re-emerge.
Yeah.
So there is no perfect language even to have this kind of a, a lot of times a very idea that we're searching for a perfect language makes us feel in very, hilarious ways. And that's what, Mika and Kettle are, I think, going through.
I don't even like to speak it. I've tried, I maybe even shouldn't have tried to speak it.
Yeah. What is the language of the reconciliation? That's where the struggle becomes. So you cannot say reconciliation with human being at all, or you can find a new way of reconciling with yourself. I'm just kidding. Yeah, I'm just putting it.
Sahil.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I actually wanted to just build off what Chetan finally said about a clinical observation, and why I want to pull that out, and I also want to talk about the fact that why, at some level, all that we are discussing is something that we are also applying to ourselves. Like you're wondering about the reconciliation within you, and I think this is something that Freud actually ends this paper very beautifully with. He says that psychoanalysis has an advantage over philosophers' musings around these this problem of sexuality and unconsciousness. And he ends with, on an abstract basis, but has demonstrated them in matters that touch every individual personally and force him to take up some attitude towards these problems. And this for me is the connection to practice.
Yeah.
This for me is also why I think academia repeatedly fails us at some level, because maybe long before it was a culture to learn logic and philosophy as part of becoming an intellectual academic. I think psychoanalysis should be part of academic, one of the stages of getting into academics, so that it forces you to reckon, with what we are experiencing, even the way we are thinking our thoughts, and also including the other, something that you were referring to about the platform, what you are trying to do with this space, the possibility of complex higher order thinking comes in through this understanding. And I think psychoanalytic understanding today in the modern condition is a very important point. And just finishing my point. So from practice, I think what we need to, at least I feel that I need to learn from Freud's this particular exposition, is that he talks about how the transformations happened cosmologically, biologically, and then psychologically. So as practice from psychoanalysis, I think we should return to the biological and the cosmological. We should think about using this practice to turn it outwards, to see how we understand and reckon with the world. I don't know how to do that, but one interesting parallel that I find is this framing, cosmological, biological, psychological, is very similar to what Sylvia Wynter is talking about when she talks about man one and man two in the historical movement, away from cosmological formulations to more scientific formulations, to finally more liberal movements. So anyways, I find all this very interesting. One last point, this is nothing to do with what I'm saying. I have a question and one fact, not fact, very good news. The question is, Cadell and others, for psychoanalysis, what grounding in philosophy would you recommend? I can see Hegel, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer. Is there anything else that you feel is essential? I'd like to know this for myself. Second thing is, University of Wisconsin-Madison Library has a copy of Global Brain Singularity.
Oh, wow.
And I will be issuing it.
Oh, wow. I wonder who ordered that. That's terrifying. Okay.
I have a few comments to make about.
Go for it, Mika. Go for it.
When I mean, I don't want to rattle the consensus too much here, but when I'm hearing the discussion about academia and so on, I'm almost tempted to say that we are seeing a paternal metaphor being used here in a historical way. So we are brought some kind of distasteful jouissance when we see the paternal name sort of flaunt or fail or being weakened, and I think that we should also question this situation itself in some ways, since it's obviously having to do with our own egoic way of how we structure our own relations. This paternal metaphor in academic, in whatever way as it's framed, I mean, I'm not seeing any kind of an obvious way in which it relates to what serious academic work itself is. And when I'm hearing this discussion, I mean, everybody's so excited about saying how the academia is so weak or it's failing us. I mean, aren't we seeing a paternal metaphor being used then?
Well, I think there's certainly a paternal metaphor at work. I think there's space for a conversation, though, in terms of how we might improve our institutional structures, that I think is being had at large, which I do think is a metaphor for the father. I do think I think saying it's a paternal metaphor doesn't necessarily mean the conversation shouldn't be had. I think it's precisely on my view is that the whole reason why I wrote Sex, Masculinity, and God was because I think we do need to have a conversation about masculinity in a positive sense and new structures. And I do think we're living in an age that is biased towards feminine subjectivity in some sense, in the sense that we can't talk about paternal forms in any way other than deconstructive modes of referring to the father. It's a tearing down of the father.
Okay, so it's one way, but I mean, it seems quite one-sided in some way for me to conceive of the situation at large in this way.
To be honest, I'm super exhausted, so I'm not at
and I would also like to return to the point about philosophy. And I mean, psychoanalysis is not a philosophy. You don't need a philosophical education to go read psychoanalysis. It's a whole other thing to read Freud and read Lacan. They are not philosophers as such. And Zizek thinks that psychoanalysis itself is something that philosophy must repress so as to function as a philosophy. So I would say that it might be beneficial. I mean, if you want to show your cards to be a good, like, learned student and gain some credits and so on, if you throw around a few like phenomenologists or these references to whatever, but psychoanalysis is a bit more radical, I think, than philosophy, since it doesn't require you to be learned and respected, and you just have to work the unconscious material, and it's a whole another thing to do psychoanalysis, since philosophy itself doesn't have any kind of a praxis in the way that psychoanalysis has. And psychoanalysis is an experience where philosophy is a open space of Socratic inquiry in things that it doesn't have a limitation for money, for time, for I mean, psychoanalysis operates with the asymmetric relation of the analyst and the analyst, and it's the primary situation is with the clinic itself. Philosophy has nothing in comparison to this. Philosophy is an open space, as I said, and the asymmetry is crucial for psychoanalysis. It's not a symmetrical relation between subjects. It's not a view of the conscious as one, or it's not. I mean, everything comes into question. It's
okay,
but it doesn't. I mean, but then again, I must say that the one thing that you might benefit from is reading Zizek's latest works, since he takes it quite seriously.
Yeah, I think what Mika's saying is, of course, extremely valuable. I would emphasize, though, that there is a quite rich field of contemporary philosophy that is trying to grapple with the consequences of psychoanalysis. Not only Zizek and Zupancic and Dollar, also figures like Adrian Johnston. And there is a wide field, and I think that's worth thinking about the relationship between philosophy and psychoanalysis. I wouldn't make such as strong a divide as Mika's making. But Alexandra, did you want to say something?
Just maybe resuming your last dialogue with Mika. Isn't this about the main observation of Freud, that it's not an intellectual problem, but it's about our capacity of holding some emotions, of some affects? And why? Because the shift we are talking about is from master discourse, from academic discourse to analytic discourse. And the question is possible an analytic discourse in academia or not? I think it is.
Well, I think it's that following Lacan's.
It's a problem of power.
Well, I think following Lacan's 4 discourses, it's about holding space for all 4 discourses. Mm-hmm. There has to be a space for the master's discourse. there has to be a space for the hysterics discourse. There has to be a space for the university discourse, and there has to be a space for the analyst discourse. I don't think that we can have just one discourse. We have to understand the relationship between the discourses.
Thank you for holding my hysterical discourse.
Well, that's why I have to hold a lot of hysterical discourse, and that's why I'm exhausted. So, but I'm willing to hold the space for the hysteric, and I'm also willing to hold the space for someone to just come and say I'm an idiot. So I do want to also thank Sahil for his final comments, though, because I thought they were quite rich and appreciated. And yeah, I do think it's worth following this relationship, but I do think I just want to say, just like Freud explicitly mentions Schopenhauer, I think we should look, I think there is a lot of value in looking at the relationship, not only with Schopenhauer and Freud, also Nietzsche and Freud, and also the German idealists in psychoanalysis. I think the whole key and the whole secret to Zizek's entire career is the relationship between German idealism and psychoanalysis. And Zizek has become, I think, without question, the most important contemporary philosopher, precisely because he was willing to really work through the tension between German idealism and psychoanalysis. So I would work there, and that's anyway where I've dedicated most of my time. And in fact, in the first course I led on the return to Freud, I structured that course, which is now available on Philosophy Portal, but I structured that course not just focused on Freud's discoveries, also on Lacan's extensions and contemporary philosophy, because I think following Alain Badiou, the great future philosophers will have to move through Lacan, and so I do think that there's a deep relationship there that's worth paying attention to. But it's also correct that psychoanalysis is something other. It's something other, and totally aligned with what Mika was saying. There's a lecture by Mladen Dollar where he talks about how philosophy is founded on the concept of the one, and psychoanalysis represents the other to the one. And this is really important to explore. And I think what's at stake in this is a capacity to hold multiplicity. Because if you just have multiplicity without really understanding the dynamics of the one and the other, I think a lot is lost. So this is a big, and I'm really exhausted now. But I'm happy to see a lot of new faces here, and I'm happy that this was a really nice conversation. For viewers, later on we covered Freud's paper from 1917, A Difficulty in the Path of Psychoanalysis, where really we're focusing on the conflict between the libido and the ego, and Freud is trying to almost write a letter to the ego, trying to tell it sort of why psychoanalysis has made an important contribution to understanding the nature of the mind, and it's symmetrical with the ego, or it's not symmetrical with consciousness. And then we've had a long conversation here with many different thinkers trying to, as usual, connect it to the broader movements in psychoanalysis and philosophy. So thank you guys all for joining me, and I hope to see you guys in the next workshop, and peace out.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken.
Thanks.